In the marble halls of justice, where truth and lies dance their eternal waltz, a single piece of paper would shatter a 1,000-year-old dynasty. The kingdom of Valdoria had weathered wars, revolutions, and scandals, but nothing could prepare the royal family for the moment when Prince Alexander Edmund Harrington stood before a judge, his entire identity hanging in the balance. The DNA results in the prosecutor's hands didn't just question his parentage. They threatened to topple a crown, expose decades of carefully guarded secrets, and reveal a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the palace. What started as whispered rumors in the servants' quarters had become a courtroom battlefield where the future of a nation would be decided by science, not birthright. The young prince's world was about to crumble, and, with it, the last remnants of royal mystique that had protected his family for generations. The ancient courthouse of Valdoria's capital had witnessed many historic moments, but never had its oak-paneled walls contained such explosive tension. Prince Alexander Edmund Harrington, third in line to the throne, sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his usually confident demeanor replaced by barely concealed anxiety. At 28, he possessed the classical features that had made the Harrington bloodline famous: sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and the aristocratic bearing that seemed bred into his very bones. Yet today, those same features felt like a mask that might be torn away at any moment. The courtroom buzzed with an electric energy that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Journalists from around the world had descended upon the small European kingdom, their cameras capturing every micro-expression that crossed the prince's face. The gallery was packed with nobility, commoners, and foreign dignitaries, all drawn by the unprecedented nature of the case. Never before had a sitting royal family member faced such a public challenge to their legitimacy. Judge Helena Whitmore, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, commanded the room with quiet authority. She had been chosen specifically for this case due to her reputation for fairness and her immunity to political pressure. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she understood that her decisions would be scrutinized for generations to come. The prosecution team, led by the formidable Attorney General Marcus Blackwood, had spent months building their case. Blackwood was a man who had built his career on exposing corruption in high places, and the opportunity to challenge the royal family represented the pinnacle of his professional ambitions. His dark suit was immaculate, his presentation flawless, but beneath the polished exterior lay a man driven by an almost missionary zeal for justice. Across from him sat the royal legal team, headed by Sir Edmund Rothschild, the kingdom's most expensive and successful defense attorney. Rothschild had defended the crown through various scandals over the past 3 decades, and his silver tongue had gotten the royal family out of seemingly impossible situations before. Yet even he seemed unusually tense as he shuffled through his meticulously prepared notes. The case had begun 6 months earlier when Maria Gonzalez, a former palace maid, had come forward with explosive allegations. Maria, now in her 50s, had worked in the royal household during the late 1990s when Queen Isabella was pregnant with Prince Alexander. Her testimony had sent shockwaves through the kingdom's carefully controlled media landscape. Maria's story was both simple and devastating. She claimed to have witnessed intimate encounters between the Queen and Captain James Morrison, the head of the Royal Guard, during the period when Prince Alexander would have been conceived. Morrison, a ruggedly handsome man with a military bearing that contrasted sharply with King Edmund's more scholarly appearance, had been a fixture in the palace for over a decade. The allegations might have been dismissed as the fantasies of a disgruntled employee, but Maria had evidence. She had kept a diary during her years of service, documenting the daily life of the palace with meticulous detail. More damaging still, she possessed photographs taken with a small camera she had used to document her work assignments. Some of these images showed the Queen and Captain Morrison in what appeared to be intimate moments, a hand on a shoulder lasting too long, whispered conversations in secluded corridors, glances that spoke of familiarity beyond the professional. The revelation had sent the palace into crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors as advisors debated how to handle the unprecedented situation. The royal family's initial response had been swift and categorical denial. They had attempted to discredit Maria's testimony and had her arrested on charges of theft, claiming she had stolen royal property when she took the photographs. However, the arrest had backfired spectacularly. Public opinion, already somewhat skeptical of the royal family's lavish lifestyle during economic hardship, began to shift dramatically. Protests erupted in the capital's squares, with citizens demanding transparency and accountability from their monarchs. The hashtag Royal Truth began trending globally, and international media picked up the story with relentless enthusiasm. Parliament, sensing the political winds, had eventually forced the king's hand. A motion of no confidence had been threatened unless the royal family agreed to submit to DNA testing to resolve the matter once and for all. The vote had been closer than anyone expected, with several longtime royal supporters crossing party lines to demand answers. Prince Alexander had watched his world unravel piece by piece. The brother he had grown up with, Prince William, had maintained public support for him while privately expressing doubts that cut deeper than any enemy's accusations. His sister, Princess Catherine, had remained loyally by his side, but even she couldn't hide the questions in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The Queen herself had become a shadow of her former regal self. Queen Isabella, once known for her grace under pressure and her ability to command any room she entered, now appeared fragile and haunted. She had aged years in a matter of months, and palace insiders reported that she barely ate and spent most of her time in her private chambers, refusing to see visitors. King Edmund's reaction had been perhaps the most telling of all. Rather than the righteous indignation one might expect from a wronged husband, the king had retreated into a cold, distant silence. He continued to perform his official duties with mechanical precision, but those who knew him well observed that something fundamental had broken in the man who had once been the kingdom's steady moral anchor. Captain Morrison himself had been suspended from duty pending the investigation, but he had maintained a dignified silence that many interpreted as either guilt or nobility. He had refused all media interviews and had been spotted only occasionally leaving his modest apartment in the capital's military district. Former colleagues described him as a man of unshakable integrity, which only made the allegations more confusing and painful for those who knew him. The legal proceedings had been delayed multiple times as both sides jockeyed for position. The prosecution had fought to make the DNA results public, while the defense had argued that such a revelation would cause irreparable harm to the monarchy and the nation's stability. International legal experts had weighed in from around the world, debating the precedent such a case might set for other constitutional monarchies. As Prince Alexander sat in the courtroom, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. He had grown up believing he was destined for greatness, trained from childhood to serve his people and uphold the traditions of his ancestors. He had studied at the finest universities, served with distinction in the military, and had dedicated himself to charitable causes that had earned him genuine admiration from the public. Now, all of that seemed like a distant dream. The charitable organizations he had founded faced funding crises as donors distanced themselves from the controversy. His military commissions had been quietly suspended, and invitations to state functions had dried up. Even his closest friends had begun to treat him differently, their conversations stilted and uncomfortable. The prince's romantic life had also suffered devastating casualties. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, whom he had been courting seriously and whom many expected him to marry, had ended their relationship through a carefully worded statement that expressed respect for his privacy during this difficult time. The dismissal had been polite but final, and Alexander understood that she could not risk her own family's reputation by association with the scandal. As the morning wore on, various witnesses took the stand to establish the timeline and context of the allegations. Palace staff members, many clearly uncomfortable with their position, testified about the routines and interactions they had observed during the relevant period. Their testimonies painted a picture of a royal household that, beneath its polished exterior, was filled with the same human complexities and emotions that affected any family. Dr. Rebecca Chun, a geneticist from the kingdom's premier university, explained the science behind DNA paternity testing to the court. Her clear, methodical presentation made it impossible for anyone to claim ignorance about what the results would definitively prove or disprove. The technology was reliable, she explained, with a certainty rate of over 99.9% when proper procedures were followed. The defense team spent considerable time questioning the chain of custody for the DNA samples and the qualifications of the testing laboratory. They raised technical objections and procedural concerns, but even to casual observers, these seemed like desperate attempts to create doubt where the science was clear. Throughout the proceedings, Prince Alexander maintained his composure, though those who knew him well could see the toll the stress was taking. His hands occasionally trembled when he thought no one was looking, and his usually perfect posture showed signs of the weight he was carrying. The young man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now seemed to be struggling simply to maintain his dignity. The courtroom drama was playing out against a backdrop of national soul-searching. Editorial pages debated whether the monarchy itself was an anachronism in the modern world, and opinion polls showed the royal family's approval ratings at historic lows. Street protesters demanded everything from complete transparency to the abolition of the monarchy altogether. International observers watched with fascination as one of Europe's last absolute monarchies faced a crisis that could fundamentally alter its character. Diplomatic cables flew between capitals as foreign governments tried to assess how the controversy might affect their relationships with Valdoria. As the first day of testimony concluded, Prince Alexander rose from his chair with the bearing of a man who understood that his entire world was balanced on a knife's edge. The next few days would determine not just his personal future, but the fate of an institution that had guided his nation for over a millennium. Part 2. The second day of proceedings began with an atmosphere of heightened anticipation that seemed to pulse through the courthouse like a living thing. Word had leaked that Maria Gonzalez would take the stand, and the media frenzy had reached fever pitch. Security had been tripled around the building as both supporters and detractors of the royal family gathered in increasingly vocal demonstrations. Maria Gonzalez appeared smaller than her photographs suggested, but her presence commanded attention nonetheless. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent years in service but had never lost her sense of self-worth. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a modest navy dress that spoke of respectability without pretension. As she was sworn in, the courtroom fell into an absolute silence that seemed to press against everyone's eardrums. Prince Alexander watched her intently, searching her face for some sign of malice or deception, but found only a woman who appeared genuinely reluctant to be there. Attorney General Blackwood approached the witness stand with the measured steps of a man who understood the gravity of the moment. His questioning began gently, establishing Maria's background and her years of faithful service to the royal household. She had been employed at the palace for 12 years, rising from a junior cleaning position to become one of the Queen's personal attendants. "Miss Gonzalez," Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "please tell the court about your duties during the summer of 1997. Maria's hands clasped together in her lap as she began to speak. Her voice was soft but clear, with the slight accent of someone for whom English was a second language. She described her daily routine of attending to the Queen's private chambers, managing her correspondence, and ensuring that her personal quarters were maintained to the highest standards. During this period, she continued, Her Majesty was experiencing what the palace physician described as a difficult pregnancy. She was often confined to bed rest and required constant attention. The testimony that followed was delivered in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it all the more devastating. Maria described observing Captain Morrison visiting the Queen's chambers at unusual hours, often when the King was away on official business. These visits, she explained, lasted far longer than any security briefing would require. "I remember one afternoon in particular," Maria said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. His Majesty was attending a trade summit in Geneva. Captain Morrison arrived at the Queen's chambers around 2 in the afternoon. I was in the adjacent sitting room, organizing correspondence. I heard voices from the bedroom, not the formal tone one would expect between a queen and her security chief, but something intimate. Sir Edmund Rothschild, the defense attorney, objected repeatedly to the subjective nature of Maria's interpretations, but Judge Whitmore allowed the testimony to continue. noting that the witness was describing her direct observations and perceptions. The most damaging part of Maria's testimony came when she produced her diary and the photographs she had taken. The diary entries, written in her careful handwriting, documented not just the dates and times of Captain Morrison's visits, but also the Queen's emotional state and behavior during this period. One entry, dated July 15, 1997, read, "Her Majesty seemed particularly anxious today. Captain Morrison stayed for over 3 hours. When he left, I noticed the Queen's appearance was disheveled, and she seemed flustered. She asked me to prepare tea for her, which was unusual as she rarely requested refreshments after his security briefings." The photographs, while not explicitly compromising, painted a picture of familiarity and intimacy that went beyond professional relationships. One image showed the Queen and Captain Morrison in the palace gardens, standing closer together than protocol would typically allow. Another captured them in what appeared to be an intense conversation in a secluded alcove, their body language suggesting emotional connection. "Why did you take these photographs?" Blackwood asked. Maria paused before answering, and, for the first time, her composure seemed to waver slightly. "At first, it was innocent. I wanted to document the beautiful moments in the palace for my own memories. But, as I began to notice patterns in the behavior, I felt compelled to record what I was seeing. I suppose I knew, even then, that these observations might someday be important. And why did you wait so many years to come forward?" "I was loyal to the royal family," Maria replied. "They had been good to me, and I respected the institution. But when Prince Alexander began to assume more public duties and was being groomed as a potential heir, I felt the weight of what I knew. The people of Valdoria deserved to know the truth about their future king." The cross-examination by Sir Edmund Rothschild was aggressive but respectful. He questioned Maria's motives, suggesting that she had been dismissed from the palace under suspicious circumstances and might be seeking revenge. He challenged the interpretation of the photographs and diary entries, arguing that they could be explained by innocent circumstances. "Miss Gonzalez," Rothschild said, his tone sharp but professional, "isn't it true that you were terminated from palace employment due to concerns about your reliability?" "No, sir," Maria responded firmly. "I left the palace because I was getting married, and my husband's job required us to move to another city. My employment record was exemplary, and I received a commendation from the Queen herself upon my departure." Rothschild pressed on, questioning the authenticity of the diary and suggesting that the entries could have been fabricated after the fact. However, handwriting experts had already authenticated the documents, and the paper and ink had been tested to confirm their age. The defense attorney's most effective line of attack focused on the subjective nature of Maria's interpretations. He argued that a security chief would naturally have frequent and lengthy meetings with the Queen, especially during a period when she was vulnerable due to pregnancy. The informal tone she described could be explained by their long professional relationship and the Queen's naturally warm personality. "You've admitted that you never witnessed any explicitly inappropriate behavior, correct?" Rothschild pressed. "That is correct," Maria acknowledged. "I never saw them in any compromising physical situation. But the emotional intimacy I observed went beyond what I had seen in her interactions with any other palace staff." As Maria's testimony concluded, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Her credibility had held up under cross-examination, and her story remained consistent. More importantly, her demeanor suggested a woman telling the truth, however painful it might be. The afternoon session brought Captain Morrison to the stand, and the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. James Morrison was 55 years old, with the bearing of a career military man. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, and his posture was ramrod straight despite the circumstances. He wore his dress uniform, which some observers interpreted as either defiance or respect for the court's authority. Morrison's testimony was carefully measured and respectful, but it contained revelations that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Under oath, he admitted to developing deep feelings for Queen Isabella during their professional relationship. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I have served the crown with honor for over 20 years. But I would be lying if I claimed that my feelings for Her Majesty remained purely professional. She is an extraordinary woman, and during a period when she was vulnerable and isolated, we found comfort in each other's company. The admission caused an audible gasp from the gallery, and Prince Alexander visibly paled. This was the first time anyone had publicly acknowledged that the relationship might have been more than professional. Captain Morrison, Blackwood continued, are you saying that you had a romantic relationship with Queen Isabella? Morrison paused for a long moment, clearly struggling with the question. I am saying that we developed a deep emotional connection during a difficult period in her life. Whether that constitutes what you would call a romantic relationship, that is for others to judge. Were you physically intimate with the Queen? I cannot, and will not answer that question, Morrison replied firmly. Some things must remain private, regardless of the circumstances. His refusal to answer was noted by the court, and Judge Whitmore informed him that his silence could be interpreted as he chose. The implication hung in the air like a sword over the proceedings. The defense team's cross-examination of Morrison focused on his military record and his character references, all of which were exemplary. They portrayed him as a man of honor who had been caught in an impossible situation and was now being unfairly pilloried for his loyalty and discretion. However, the damage had been done. Morrison's admission of emotional involvement, combined with his refusal to deny physical intimacy, had provided the prosecution with the foundation they needed for their case. As the day's proceedings concluded, legal analysts on television and social media began dissecting every word that had been spoken. The consensus seemed to be that the prosecution had made significant gains, but that the ultimate question, Prince Alexander's paternity, could only be answered by science. The royal family, meanwhile, maintained their public silence, though palace sources reported that emergency meetings were being held throughout the evening. King Edmund had not attended the court proceedings, claiming pressing matters of state, but his absence was widely interpreted as an inability to face the public revelation of his wife's possible infidelity. Prince Alexander returned to his apartment in the capital that evening rather than the palace, seeking to avoid the media circus that had set up camp outside the royal residence. He found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time in days, contemplating a future that had become completely uncertain. The young prince stood at his window, looking out at the city he had been raised to serve, and wondered if the people looking back at him would still accept his leadership once the DNA results were revealed. The weight of uncertainty was almost unbearable, but tomorrow would bring new testimony and move them all one step closer to a truth that would change everything. Part 3. The third day of the trial dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the kingdom. The courthouse was surrounded by an even larger crowd than before, with protesters carrying signs ranging from "Truth for Valdoria" to "Protect our Prince." The nation seemed to be holding its breath as the proceedings moved inexorably toward the revelation that would define the monarchy's future. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Today would bring the testimony of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the geneticist who had overseen the DNA testing process. Her findings would either vindicate Prince Alexander or shatter his world completely. Queen Isabella made her first appearance in the courtroom gallery, and her presence caused a noticeable stir. She sat with perfect posture, her face a mask of royal composure. But those who looked closely could see the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. She wore a simple black dress that seemed to reflect the gravity of the situation. Prince Alexander turned to look at his mother as she entered, and, for a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. The pain and love that passed between them was visible to all, and several observers later commented on the heartbreaking nature of that silent exchange. Dr. Thornfield was sworn in with the same ceremony as previous witnesses, but her testimony would carry far more weight than any that had come before. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her a scholarly appearance. Her credentials were impeccable. She had trained at the world's finest universities and had overseen thousands of paternity tests during her career. Attorney General Blackwood approached her with the respect due to a scientific expert, but his questions were pointed and designed to establish the reliability and accuracy of DNA testing beyond any reasonable doubt. Dr. Thornfield, he began, please explain to the court the process by which DNA paternity testing is conducted. The geneticist launched into a clear, methodical explanation of how genetic markers are analyzed to determine biological relationships. She used simple language that made the complex science accessible to the jury and gallery, explaining how DNA evidence could establish paternity with near absolute certainty. In this particular case, she continued, we analyzed genetic samples from Prince Alexander, King Edmund, and Captain Morrison. We examined over 20 different genetic markers to ensure the highest possible accuracy. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as everyone understood that the moment of truth was approaching. Dr. Blackwood said, his voice carrying through the silent room. Based on your analysis of these genetic samples, what are your findings regarding the paternity of Prince Alexander Edmund Harrington? Dr. Thornfield looked directly at Prince Alexander before answering, her professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine sympathy for the young man whose life hung in the balance. Based on the genetic analysis, she said clearly, King Edmund cannot be the biological father of Prince Alexander. The probability of paternity is 0%. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, and the sound of people rising to their feet created a cacophony that Judge Whitmore had to silence with repeated strikes of her gavel. Prince Alexander sat frozen in his chair, his face having gone completely white. In the gallery, Queen Isabella appeared to have stopped breathing entirely, while tears began streaming down her face. Furthermore, Dr. Thornfield continued once order was restored, the genetic markers present in Prince Alexander's DNA are consistent with Captain Morrison being his biological father. The probability of paternity in this case is 99.97%. If the first revelation had caused chaos, this confirmation sent the courtroom into an absolute frenzy. Security guards moved quickly to maintain order as reporters tried to push forward, and spectators shouted questions and exclamations. Several people appeared to faint, and the noise level became almost unbearable. Judge Whitmore called for a 30-minute recess to allow the courtroom to be cleared and reorganized. During this time, Prince Alexander sat motionless in his chair, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't process what he had just heard. His legal team gathered around him, speaking in urgent whispers, but he seemed unable to respond to their words. When proceedings resumed, the courtroom was noticeably quieter, but the tension remained palpable. Dr. Thornfield's cross-examination by the defense team was thorough but ultimately futile. The science was unambiguous, and her methodology was beyond reproach. Sir Edmund Rothschild attempted to raise questions about sample contamination and testing procedures, but every challenge was met with detailed documentation and scientific evidence. Dr. Thornfield, Rothschild said during his cross-examination, you've stated that the probability of Captain Morrison being Prince Alexander's father is 99.97%. What accounts for that small percentage of uncertainty? That margin accounts for the extremely remote possibility of an identical twin brother or other genetic anomaly, she replied. However, given Captain Morrison's known family history and the lack of any evidence for such circumstances, the certainty is effectively absolute. The afternoon session brought a parade of character witnesses for both sides. Former palace staff members testified about Queen Isabella's character and her devotion to her family. Military colleagues spoke of Captain Morrison's integrity and professionalism. The testimonies painted pictures of two fundamentally decent people who had found themselves in an impossible situation. However, the most dramatic moment came when Father Benedict O'Malley, the palace chaplain, took the stand. The elderly priest had served the royal family for over 30 years and was widely respected throughout the kingdom for his wisdom and moral authority. Father O'Malley, Blackwood said respectfully, did Queen Isabella ever seek spiritual counsel from you during the summer of 1997? The priest's weathered face showed deep sadness as he answered, yes, she did. Her Majesty came to me in great distress during that period. She spoke of feelings of loneliness and confusion, and she struggled with what she described as temptations of the heart. Did she confess anything specific to you? I cannot, and will not reveal the details of confession, Father O'Malley said firmly. However, I can say that Her Majesty was a woman in great spiritual turmoil, seeking guidance about how to balance her duties as queen with her human needs for emotional connection. The priest's testimony, while maintaining the sanctity of confession, provided powerful evidence that the queen had indeed been struggling with the moral implications of her relationship with Captain Morrison during the crucial period. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the full weight of the revelations began to sink in throughout the kingdom. Television news programs provided wall-to-wall coverage, with constitutional experts debating the implications of the findings. The question was no longer whether Prince Alexander was King Edmund's biological son. The science had settled that definitively. Now the focus shifted to what this revelation would mean for the monarchy itself. Legal scholars pointed out that Valdoria's constitution made no explicit provision for situations where royal paternity was called into question. The succession laws assumed that legitimate marriages produced legitimate heirs, but they had never contemplated the possibility of documented infidelity, proving that assumption false. Parliament announced an emergency session to address the constitutional crisis, while political parties began positioning themselves for what many saw as an inevitable upheaval in the nation's governance. Some called for the abolition of the monarchy entirely, arguing that the scandal had exposed the institution as fundamentally corrupt and outdated. Others, however, rallied to support both Queen Isabella and Prince Alexander, arguing that personal failings should not invalidate centuries of constitutional tradition. They pointed out that the prince had been raised as a royal, had been trained for leadership, and had demonstrated admirable character throughout his life, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. International reaction was swift and varied. Some European monarchies expressed quiet support for their Valdorian counterparts, while republics around the world pointed to the scandal as evidence of monarchies' inherent instability. Diplomatic relationships that had been carefully cultivated over decades suddenly became uncertain as foreign governments tried to assess how the crisis would affect their bilateral agreements. The financial markets also reacted dramatically to the news. The Valdorian currency fell to historic lows against major international currencies, while the country's sovereign debt ratings came under review by major agencies. Tourism, a significant part of the kingdom's economy, was projected to suffer massive losses as the royal family's appeal to international visitors evaporated. Prince Alexander spent the evening in isolation, refusing all visitors except his sister, Princess Catherine. She found him sitting in his study, staring at a portrait of King Edmund that had hung there for years. The painting depicted his father, or rather, the man he had believed to be his father, in full ceremonial regalia, looking every inch the monarch. "What am I supposed to do now, Cat?" he asked without looking up from the portrait. "Everything I believed about myself, everything I was raised to become, it's all been built on a lie." Princess Catherine, a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence, sat beside her brother and took his hand. "You're still my brother," she said firmly. "You're still the same man who has dedicated his life to serving our people. Your birth doesn't change the person you've become." "But I'm not really a prince," Alexander replied, his voice hollow with despair. "I have no legitimate claim to the throne, no right to the title I've carried my entire life. I'm just the son of a palace guard." "You're the son of a good man who loved our mother," Catherine countered. "Captain Morrison isn't some villain in this story. He's a man of honor who served our family faithfully for decades. If he is your father, then you come from good stock on both sides." Their conversation continued late into the night, as brother and sister grappled with a reality that neither had ever imagined possible. Outside their window, the lights of the capital twinkled below them, representing millions of citizens whose lives would also be affected by the day's revelations. Meanwhile, at Captain Morrison's modest apartment across the city, the man who had just been revealed as the prince's biological father sat alone with a glass of whiskey, contemplating the ruins of his carefully ordered life. He had known this day might come ever since that summer 28 years ago when he had allowed his heart to override his duty. Now, the secret he had carried for so long was exposed to the world, and there would be no returning to the quiet dignity he had maintained for so many years. As the kingdom settled into an uneasy sleep, everyone understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would reshape the monarchy forever. The DNA results had answered one question definitively, but they had raised dozens of others that would prove far more difficult to resolve. Part 4, the fourth day, brought an unexpected development that would prove to be the most emotionally devastating of all the proceedings. King Edmund, who had maintained his dignified silence throughout the trial, announced through his attorneys that he wished to address the court personally. The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal teams and created a media sensation unlike anything the kingdom had previously experienced. The king arrived at the courthouse in his official state vehicle, flanked by security that had been tripled due to the increasingly volatile public sentiment. Crowds lined the streets, some showing support with signs reading, "We stand with our king," while others demanded his abdication with chants of truth and justice. The scene resembled a political revolution more than a legal proceeding. King Edmund entered the courtroom wearing his military dress uniform, every medal and decoration precisely placed according to protocol. At 62, he remained an imposing figure, though the stress of recent events had clearly taken its toll. His usually perfect posture showed slight signs of weariness, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and emotional turmoil. Prince Alexander watched his father, the man who had raised him, loved him, and prepared him for a life of service, walk to the witness stand with measured, dignified steps. The pain in the young man's eyes was visible to everyone in the courtroom as he realized that this testimony might be the final dissolution of the relationship that had defined his entire existence. Judge Whitmore administered the oath with particular solemnity, understanding that she was swearing in a reigning monarch who was about to address the most personal crisis of his reign. The moment carried historic weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. Attorney General Blackwood approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance. Questioning a sitting king, even under these circumstances, went against every instinct of deference that had been ingrained in him since childhood. His voice was respectful but firm as he began. "Your Majesty, the court appreciates your willingness to testify in these difficult circumstances. Can you please state your knowledge of the relationship between Queen Isabella and Captain Morrison during the summer of 1997? King Edmund's response would haunt the courtroom for the remainder of the proceedings. His voice, usually commanding and certain, carried a weight of sadness that transformed his words into something approaching a confession. "I have known about my wife's relationship with Captain Morrison for over 25 years, he said quietly. "I knew when Alexander was conceived, and I have known throughout his entire life that he was not my biological son." The admission struck the courtroom like a physical blow. If the DNA results had been shocking, this revelation was absolutely devastating. Gasps echoed throughout the gallery, and several people could be heard weeping openly. Prince Alexander appeared to stop breathing entirely, his face cycling through expressions of shock, betrayal, and heartbreak. "You knew?" Blackwood asked, clearly struggling to process the king's words. "You've known for 28 years that Prince Alexander was not your biological child?" "Yes," the king replied simply. "Isabella came to me in tears after her relationship with Captain Morrison ended. She was pregnant and terrified of what it would mean for our marriage and the monarchy. We made a decision together to raise the child as our own and to never speak of the truth to anyone." The questioning continued, revealing a story of love, sacrifice, and impossible choices that painted all the principles in a more sympathetic light than anyone had expected. King Edmund described the summer of 1997 as a period when his marriage had been strained by the pressures of royal life and his own emotional distance. "I was not a good husband during that time," he admitted with painful honesty. "I was consumed with affairs of state and failed to provide Isabella with the emotional support she needed. When she found comfort with Captain Morrison, I was angry, but I also understood that I bore responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to their relationship." "Why did you choose to raise Prince Alexander as your own son?" Blackwood asked. The king turned to look directly at Prince Alexander for the first time since entering the courtroom. The love and pride in his eyes were unmistakable as he answered. "Because from the moment he was born, he was my son in every way that mattered. I held him first, I taught him his first words. I bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his achievements. Biology is just science. Love is what makes a father. The emotional impact of these words was devastating. Prince Alexander began crying openly, and even some of the hardened court reporters were seen wiping away tears. Queen Isabella, watching from the gallery, appeared to be barely holding herself together as her husband publicly forgave her and defended their son. Did you ever consider revealing the truth? The prosecutor continued. Many times, King Edmund replied, especially as Alexander grew older and began to take on more royal responsibilities. But he had proven himself to be everything a king should be: intelligent, compassionate, dedicated to his people. His parentage seemed irrelevant compared to his character. The defense team's cross-examination was gentle, almost reverential. Sir Edmund Rothschild focused on establishing the king's unwavering love for Prince Alexander and his belief that the young man was fully qualified to serve as a future monarch regardless of his biological origins.